The rain fell in sheets that night, turning the city streets into shiny mirrors that reflected the neon signs and streetlights. Jasmine pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders as she hurried home from her shift at Molly's Diner. Her feet ached after 8 hours of running back and forth with plates of burgers and fries, and all she wanted was to collapse into her bed. The bus had dropped her off 3 blocks from her apartment building, and now she was regretting not bringing an umbrella. Her curly hair was already soaked, droplets running down her face despite the hood she pulled up. Jasmine checked her phone, 11:42 p.m. She had an early nursing class tomorrow, and these late shifts were killing her, but the bills wouldn't pay themselves. She was about to cross the street when she noticed something, or rather someone, huddled in the doorway of Wilson's hardware store, which had closed hours ago. An old woman sat there, her thin white hair plastered to her head from the rain. She wore a light blue jacket that was completely soaked through, and beside her was a plastic shopping bag and a small rolling suitcase with a broken wheel. Jasmine almost kept walking. It wasn't that she didn't care, she did, but in the city, you learn to keep to yourself. Mind your business. Stay safe. But something made her stop. Maybe it was the way the woman's hands trembled as she tried to pull her wet jacket closer. Maybe it was how small she looked there, alone in the night. "Hey," Jasmine called, taking a step closer. "You okay over there?" The woman looked up, startled. Her face was lined with wrinkles, her blue eyes cloudy with confusion. She must have been in her 60s, maybe older. "I'm fine, dear," the woman said, but her voice shook with the cold. "Just resting a moment." Jasmine glanced around. The street was empty except for a few cars passing by, their headlights cutting through the rain. "You don't look fine," Jasmine said, moving closer to the storefront to get out of the rain herself. "It's pouring and it's late. Do you have somewhere to go?" The woman looked down at her hands. They were red from the cold, with blue veins running beneath thin skin. "I did, yesterday." Her voice was so quiet Jasmine could barely hear it over the rain. "What's your name?" Jasmine asked, crouching down to eye level. "Martha," the woman said. "Martha Winters." "I'm Jasmine Taylor. What happened yesterday, Martha?" The story came out in bits and pieces. Martha's Social Security check hadn't arrived. Her landlord, already frustrated with previous late payments, had changed the locks. She'd been able to grab only what she could carry. For 3 days, she'd been wandering, too afraid to go to the shelters she'd heard terrible stories about. "My Harold always said we should save more," Martha said, her eyes filling with tears that mixed with the raindrops on her cheeks. "But after he got sick, the bills just kept coming." Jasmine stood there, rain soaking through her shoes. She thought about her tiny apartment with its leaky faucet and noisy radiator. She thought about her morning class, about how her mom had always warned her not to bring strangers home. She thought about her grandmother, who died last year, and how she had the same soft white hair as Martha. Jasmine made a decision that surprised even herself. "Martha," she said, offering her hand. "It's too wet and cold out here. Why don't you come home with me tonight? It's nothing fancy, but I've got a couch, a shower, and I can make some hot soup. Tomorrow we can figure things out." Martha looked up, suspicion and hope battling across her face. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Jasmine shrugged, a small smile touching her lips. "Maybe not, but I know what it's like to need help. And my grandma would haunt me forever if I left you out in this rain." Martha hesitated, then reached out a trembling hand. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," Jasmine said, helping Martha to her feet and picking up the small suitcase. "Come on, it's not far." As they walked slowly through the rain, Jasmine wondered if she was being foolish. But sometimes, she thought, the foolish thing and the right thing were exactly the same. The walk to Jasmine's apartment took twice as long as usual. Martha moved slowly, her legs stiff from sitting in the cold for so many hours. The broken wheel on her small suitcase kept catching on cracks in the sidewalk, forcing them to stop every few steps. But Jasmine didn't mind. She held her jacket over both their heads, trying to shield them from the worst of the rain. "Just one more block," Jasmine said, pointing to a brick building up ahead. "I'm on the 3rd floor." Martha nodded, her breath coming in short puffs. "I'm slowing you down." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Jasmine said. "We're almost there." The stairwell in Jasmine's building smelled like old cooking and cheap air freshener, but it was dry and warm. Martha gripped the railing tightly as they climbed, pausing often to catch her breath. By the time they reached the third floor, her face was flushed with effort. Jasmine unlocked her door, 2 locks and a chain, and flicked on the lights. Her one-bedroom apartment was small but tidy. A faded blue couch faced a small TV, and beyond that was a kitchenette with just enough counter space for a microwave and coffee maker. A narrow hallway led to the bathroom and bedroom. "It's not much," Jasmine said, suddenly aware of the water stain on the ceiling and the patch job she'd done on the couch with duct tape. "But it's home." "It's wonderful," Martha said, and something in her voice told Jasmine she meant it. "Let me show you the bathroom. You can take a hot shower while I make us something to eat." Jasmine found a clean towel and her largest t-shirt and sweatpants. They would be big on Martha's thin frame, but they were soft and dry. She showed Martha how to work the temperamental shower knob. Turn it all the way left, then back a quarter turn or it gets too hot, and left her to clean up. In the kitchen, Jasmine opened her nearly empty fridge. She had eggs, half a block of cheese, some milk that was still good for a few more days, and leftover rice from yesterday's takeout. She could make a simple fried rice with scrambled eggs. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. As she cooked, Jasmine could hear the shower running and Martha's soft humming. It was an old song, something her own grandmother used to hum while folding laundry. The sound brought an unexpected lump to Jasmine's throat. What was she doing? Her mum would freak if she knew Jasmine had brought a stranger home. But something about Martha's eyes, the way they lit up with surprise when Jasmine offered help, it reminded her that behind every homeless person was a real story, a real life that had somehow slipped off track. 20 minutes later, Martha emerged from the bathroom looking years younger. Her white hair was combed back from her face, and though Jasmine's clothes hung loose on her small frame, she stood straighter, some dignity restored by the simple act of being clean. "Something smells good," Martha said, her voice stronger now. "Just some fried rice and eggs, nothing special." Jasmine set 2 mismatched plates on the small folding table she used for meals. "Come eat while it's hot." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the sound of rain against the windows the only noise. Then Martha put down her fork. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Most people just walk by. They don't even look at me anymore. Like I'm invisible." Jasmine thought about it as she chewed. "I guess. I believe we're supposed to look out for each other. My grandma raised me that way. She always said you never know when you might be the one needing help." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "Your grandma was a wise woman." "She was," Jasmine said with a smile. "She would have liked you." After dinner, Jasmine made up the couch with clean sheets and her spare blanket. She found an old phone charger that might work with Martha's ancient flip phone, and they plugged it in, hoping it would turn on by morning. "Tomorrow we can call some people," Jasmine said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "There are programs that can help. We'll figure something out." As she turned to go to her own room, Martha caught her hand. Her palm was soft and paper-thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't forget this kindness." That night, Jasmine fell asleep to the sound of rain and the unfamiliar but somehow comforting knowledge that she wasn't alone in her apartment. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing, but tonight it had felt simple, as natural as breathing. Jasmine woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, she was confused. She lived alone, and her cheap coffee maker didn't have a timer. Then she remembered Martha, and the events of the previous night came flooding back. She found Martha in the kitchen, carefully pouring hot water through the coffee filter by hand, since the machine was acting up again. "Good morning," Martha said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to thank you somehow." "Not at all," Jasmine said, touched by the gesture. She glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m. She had class at 9 o'clock. "You're up early." "Old habits," Martha said with a small smile. "When you get older, sleep becomes a luxury." And after sleeping on concrete for a few nights, that couch felt like a cloud. Jasmine accepted a mug of coffee, surprised by how good it tasted. "This is way better than mine usually turns out." "The secret is to let the water cool just a bit after boiling," Martha said. Too hot and it burns the grounds. They sat at Jasmine's small table, watching as the morning light filtered through the cheap blinds. In the daylight, Martha looked both better and worse than she had last night. The hot shower and sleep had brought color back to her cheeks, but Jasmine could now clearly see how thin she was, how her collarbones protruded sharply from Jasmine's too big t-shirt. So, Jasmine said, "I have class this morning, but before I go, I thought we could make some calls. There's a community center not far from here that helps people find emergency housing." Martha stared into her coffee cup. "I don't want to be a burden. You've already done so much." "It's not a burden," Jasmine insisted. "Look, I know how it feels when things fall apart. After my mom got sick last year, I almost had to drop out of nursing school. The bills were piling up, and I was working double shifts just to keep the lights on. But people helped us, neighbors, church folks, even my grumpy old professor who gave me extensions on assignments." She reached across the table and lightly touched Martha's hand. "Sometimes you need to let people help you so you can get back on your feet." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I had a life once, you know. A house with a garden. I was a kindergarten teacher for 30 years. Then Harold, my husband, got cancer. The insurance covered some, but not all. We sold the house, used up our savings." Her voice trailed off. "After he died, everything just unraveled." Jasmine felt a lump in her throat. How quickly a normal life could dissolve, she thought. How thin the line was between stability and chaos. "Tell me about your husband," she said softly. Martha's face lit up. Harold was a gentle soul, worked as a librarian. He could fix anything: cars, appliances, broken hearts. She laughed, a sound like rusty bells. "We were married for 42 years. Had a son too." Jasmine perked up. "You have a son? Could we call him?" The light dimmed in Martha's eyes. "Bobby and I, we haven't spoken in years. He didn't approve of how we spent our retirement savings on Harold's treatments. Thought we should have tried cheaper options." She shook her head. "He has his own family now. Lives somewhere up north." Jasmine didn't push. Family was complicated, she knew that all too well. After breakfast, Jasmine made some calls while Martha washed their mugs, insisting on helping somehow. The community center could see Martha today, and Jasmine found a women's clothing bank that opened at 10:00 a.m. "I have to run to class," Jasmine said, gathering her backpack and textbooks. "But I wrote down the address of the center, it's walking distance. And here's my phone number." She pressed a slip of paper into Martha's hand. "Call me if you need anything, anything at all." Martha held the paper like it was precious. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Jasmine said, heading for the door. "Oh, and the spare key is on the hook by the fridge. Lock up if you go out, but you're welcome to stay until we figure something out." She was halfway down the hallway when Martha called after her. "Jasmine." She turned back. "Your mother raised a good woman," Martha said. "She must be very proud." Jasmine smiled, a warm feeling spreading through her chest despite the cloudy morning ahead. "I'll be back around 3:00. We can grab some real food then." As she hurried to catch her bus, Jasmine wondered briefly if she was being naive. Her roommate from last year would have called her crazy for leaving a stranger in her apartment. But something told her Martha wouldn't betray her trust. Sometimes you just had to have faith in people, even when the world gave you every reason not to. Jasmine rushed through her morning classes, her mind constantly drifting back to Martha. Had she gone to the community center? Was she still at the apartment? During her lunch break, she almost called home to check but stopped herself. Martha wasn't a child. She was a grown woman who had managed on her own for decades before hitting a rough patch. By the time her last class ended at 2:30, rain clouds had gathered again. Jasmine hurried to catch the early bus, clutching a bag of groceries she picked up between classes. Nothing fancy, just bread, eggs, some fresh vegetables, and a chocolate bar. Her budget was tight, but she'd skipped her usual coffee shop stop to afford a few extras. The bus was crowded with afternoon commuters, and Jasmine squeezed into a seat near the back, balancing the grocery bag on her lap. The woman next to her smiled. "Long day?" she asked. "Kind of," Jasmine replied. "But heading home now." Home? With someone waiting there? The thought felt strange but somehow nice. As the bus neared her stop, Jasmine felt a flutter of nerves. What if Martha had taken her things? She immediately felt guilty for the thought. Martha wasn't a thief, she was just someone down on her luck. Jasmine climbed the stairs to her apartment, juggling her backpack, groceries, and umbrella. As she reached her floor, she heard voices from down the hall, deep, official-sounding voices coming from the direction of her apartment. Her heart jumped into her throat. 2 police officers stood outside her door, which was slightly ajar. One was talking into a radio clipped to his shoulder. The other, a tall woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, was writing something in a small notebook. Jasmine froze, then forced herself to keep walking. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd just helped someone in need. "Excuse me," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "That's my apartment." Both officers turned to look at her. The male officer was younger, maybe in his 30s, with a clean-shaven face and watchful eyes. The female officer was older, with lines around her mouth that deepened as she frowned. "Are you Jasmine Taylor?" the female officer asked. Jasmine nodded, clutching her grocery bag tighter. "Yes. What's going on? Is Martha okay?" The officers exchanged a look that made Jasmine's stomach clench. "Miss Taylor, I'm Officer Chen, and this is Officer Rodriguez," the woman said. "We'd like to ask you some questions about Martha Winters." "She didn't do anything wrong," Jasmine said quickly. "She was just homeless, and it was raining, so I let her stay on my couch. That's not illegal, is it?" "No, ma'am, it's not," Officer Rodriguez said. His voice was gentler than his partner's. "May we come inside and talk?" Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into her apartment, half expecting to find it ransacked. But everything looked exactly as she'd left it that morning. Martha's borrowed clothes were folded neatly on the couch. The coffee mugs were clean and put away. The only sign that Martha had been there at all was a handwritten note on the table, held down by a small stone. "Where is she?" Jasmine asked, looking around. "Did something happen?" Officer Chen cleared her throat. "Martha Winters is currently at Memorial Hospital. She's physically fine," she added quickly, seeing the alarm on Jasmine's face. "But there are some complications." "What kind of complications?" Jasmine set down her groceries and backpack, her mind racing. Had Martha been attacked? Had she gotten sick? Officer Rodriguez gestured to the small table. "Maybe we should sit down." Jasmine sat, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She noticed Officer Chen looking around her apartment, taking in the water stain on the ceiling, the textbooks stacked by the couch, the faded curtains. "Miss Taylor, how long have you known Mrs. Winters?" Officer Chen asked. "Since last night," Jasmine admitted. "I found her outside Wilson's Hardware during the rainstorm. She told me she'd been evicted." The officers exchanged another look. "And she spent the night here? On your couch?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "Yes." Jasmine felt defensive now. "Look, what's going on? Why are you asking me all these questions about Martha?" Officer Chen sighed. "Mrs. Winters wasn't evicted, Miss Taylor. She's been reported missing from Sunny Pines Assisted Living Facility in Glenwood. That's about 200 miles from here." Jasmine blinked, trying to process this information. "Missing?" "But she told me." "Mrs. Winters suffers from early-onset dementia," Officer Rodriguez said gently. "The facility reported her missing 3 weeks ago. A son has been searching for her since then." Jasmine's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with the articulate, coherent woman she'd spent the evening with, but she seemed fine. She told me about her husband's medical bills, about being evicted. People with dementia often blend real memories with confabulations, stories they believe are true but aren't, Officer Chen explained, her voice softening slightly. "Mrs. Winters' husband did die of cancer 5 years ago, and she did lose her home afterward. But she's been living at Sunny Pines for the past 3 years." Jasmine picked up Martha's note with trembling fingers. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Dear Jasmine, thank you for your kindness. Going to find Harold at the library. He's waiting for me. Martha." A chill ran down Jasmine's spine. Harold. The husband Martha had said died years ago. "How did you find her?" Jasmine asked quietly. "She went to the library downtown," Officer Rodriguez said. "Started asking for someone named Harold. When the librarian told her there was no Harold working there, she became distressed. The librarian called us, and when we ran her name through the system, the missing persons report came up. Jasmine felt tears prick her eyes. Poor Martha, wandering lost and confused, creating a story that made sense of her fragmented memories. Her son is flying in tonight, Officer Chen said, her voice gentler now. He asked us to thank whoever had helped his mother. Said it was a miracle she survived 3 weeks on her own. Jasmine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about Martha making coffee that morning, sharing stories about her husband, folding her borrowed clothes before leaving. Despite her confusion, there had been such dignity in her actions. "We'll need to take a statement," Officer Rodriguez said. "But first, is there anything else you can tell us about Mrs. Winter's time with you? Anything that might help her doctors?" Jasmine took a deep breath and began to tell them everything, wondering what tomorrow would bring when Martha's son arrived. After the police left, Jasmine sat alone in her apartment, Martha's notes still in her hands. The silence felt heavy. She'd given her statement, explaining how she found Martha and brought her home. The officers had been surprisingly kind, telling her she'd probably saved Martha's life by taking her in from the storm. But Jasmine couldn't shake the hollow feeling in her chest. She kept thinking about Martha's stories, how much had been real and how much had been confused memories. The husband with cancer had been real. The lost home had been real. But somewhere along the way, Martha's mind had started mixing up the past and present, leaving her lost and alone on the streets. The next morning dawned gray and cool. Jasmine had barely slept, and she considered skipping her classes. But her nursing ethics professor was giving an important lecture she couldn't miss. So she dragged herself to campus, sat through her classes with her mind elsewhere, and hurried back home as soon as she could. She had just changed into sweatpants when there was a knock at her door. Her heart jumped. The police again. But when she peered through the peephole, she saw a tall man in a rumpled suit, his graying hair neatly combed despite the signs of travel exhaustion on his face. Jasmine opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Jasmine Taylor." The man's voice was deep and tired. When she nodded, he continued, "I'm Robert Winters, Martha's son. The hospital gave me your address. I hope you don't mind me stopping by." Jasmine's mouth went dry. She hadn't expected Martha's son to actually come to her apartment. "No, of course not. Please come in." Robert ducked slightly to enter her small apartment. He looked around, taking in the modest furniture, the textbooks, the single plant struggling on the windowsill. Jasmine suddenly saw her home through a stranger's eyes, the cheap furniture from thrift stores, the patches on the couch, the water stain on the ceiling that her landlord kept promising to fix. "It's not much," she said, echoing what she told Martha just 2 nights ago. "But it's home." Robert shook his head. "It's more than enough. That's why I'm here, to thank you." His voice caught slightly. "The doctors said with the storm that night, if my mother had stayed out," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Please, sit down," Jasmine said, gesturing to the couch. "Can I get you some water or coffee?" "Water would be great," Robert said, lowering his tall frame onto her sofa, the same spot where Martha had slept. Jasmine noticed his hands were just like his mother's, long fingers, prominent veins, a slight tremble. She brought 2 glasses of water and sat in the chair across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. "How is she?" Jasmine finally asked. Robert took a sip of water before answering. "Stable. The doctors say she's dehydrated and has a minor chest infection, but otherwise okay. Physically, at least." He stared down at his glass. "Her dementia has gotten worse since she left the facility. The doctors think the stress of being lost accelerated her confusion." "She seemed so, with it," Jasmine said. "We had conversations. She made coffee. She told me stories about her husband, your father." Robert nodded. "Dad died 5 years ago. That's when things started falling apart." He looked up at Jasmine, his eyes tired but kind. "Mom was a kindergarten teacher for 30 years, smart as a whip. The dementia started small, forgetting where she put her keys, mixing up names. We thought it was just age. But after Dad died, it got worse quickly." Jasmine thought about Martha carefully pouring water through the coffee filter that morning, explaining that the secret was to let the water cool slightly after boiling. "What happened?" she asked softly. "How did she end up on the streets?" Robert ran a hand over his face. She walked out of Sunny Pines 3 weeks ago. Just put on her jacket and walked past the front desk when the receptionist was on the phone. By the time they realized she was gone, he shook his head. We've been searching ever since. The police, private investigators, volunteers. How she got all the way to this city, I'll never know. She mentioned buses, Jasmine said, remembering fragments of Martha's story. I think she might have been following the routes she and your dad used to take. Robert looked surprised. They used to take weekend trips by bus. Dad hated flying. He leaned forward. What else did she tell you? Jasmine told him everything she could remember. Martha's stories about teaching kindergarten, about Harold's job as a librarian, about their garden. With each detail, Robert's eyes grew more pained, but also more grateful. That's my mom, he said softly when Jasmine finished. Even lost in her confusion, those core memories stayed with her. She mentioned you too, Jasmine said carefully. She said you hadn't spoken in years, that you didn't approve of how they spent their retirement on your dad's treatments. Robert's face crumpled slightly. We argued once, just once, about an experimental treatment Dad wanted to try. I was worried it would drain their savings for nothing. But I never, he swallowed hard. We didn't stop speaking. I call her every Sunday. I visit once a month, but in her mind, that argument never ended. Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy. How painful it must be to have your mother forget your reconciliation, to have her remember only the worst moment between you. The doctors said people with dementia sometimes fixate on painful memories, Robert continued. They get stuck in loops of old hurts. He looked around the apartment again. I still can't believe a complete stranger took her in. Most people would have just walked past. Jasmine thought about how close she had come to doing exactly that. I almost did, she admitted, but something about her reminded me of my grandmother. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I want to repay you somehow. The police told me you're a nursing student. This isn't much, but... Jasmine shook her head firmly. I don't want money. I didn't help your mother for a reward. I understand that, Robert said gently, but you did something extraordinary. Please at least let me cover your rent for a month, so you can cut back on work hours and focus on your studies. The offer was tempting. Jasmine's next rent payment was looming, and her hours at the diner had been cut back recently. But something about taking money felt wrong. Can I think about it? She asked. Robert nodded, setting the envelope on the coffee table. Of course. And there's something else I wanted. That's my mom, he said softly when Jasmine finished. Even lost in her confusion, those core memories stayed with her. She mentioned you too, Jasmine said carefully. She said you hadn't spoken in years, that you didn't approve of how they spent their retirement on your dad's treatments. Robert's face crumpled slightly. We argued once, just once, about an experimental treatment Dad wanted to try. I was worried it would drain their savings for nothing. But I never, he swallowed hard. We didn't stop speaking. I call her every Sunday. I visit once a month, but in her mind, that argument never ended. Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy. How painful it must be to have your mother forget your reconciliation, to have her remember only the worst moment between you. The doctors said people with dementia sometimes fixate on painful memories, Robert continued. They get stuck in loops of old hurts. He looked around the apartment again. I still can't believe a complete stranger took her in. Most people would have just walked past. Jasmine thought about how close she had come to doing exactly that. I almost did, she admitted, but something about her reminded me of my grandmother. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I want to repay you somehow. The police told me you're a nursing student. This isn't much, but... Jasmine shook her head firmly. I don't want money. I didn't help your mother for a reward. I understand that, Robert said gently, but you did something extraordinary. Please at least let me cover your rent for a month, so you can cut back on work hours and focus on your studies. The offer was tempting. Jasmine's next rent payment was looming, and her hours at the diner had been cut back recently. But something about taking money felt wrong. Can I think about it? She asked. Robert nodded, setting the envelope on the coffee table. Of course. And there's something else I wanted to ask you. to ask you. Robert leaned forward, his fingers laced together. Would you consider visiting my mother at the hospital? The doctors say familiar faces can help ground patients with dementia. And even though you only spent one night together, he shrugged. She keeps asking about the kind girl who made her soup. Jasmine felt a flutter in her chest. She remembers me. Some things stick even when others fade, Robert said. Whatever connection you two made, it seems to have left an impression. Jasmine didn't hesitate. Of course I'll visit her. I have class until 2 o'clock tomorrow, but I could come after that. The relief on Robert's face was immediate and genuine. Thank you. I can pick you up if that helps. They arranged a time, and Robert stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. The envelope, please think about it, not as payment but as thanks. Sometimes accepting help is as important as giving it. After he left, Jasmine sat staring at the envelope. Her pride wanted to leave it untouched, but her practical side knew how much she was struggling. In the end, she tucked it into her textbook without opening it. She'd decide later. The next afternoon, Robert's car, a sensible blue sedan, was waiting outside her building. The drive to Memorial Hospital took 15 minutes, during which Robert filled Jasmine in on what to expect. She has good days and bad days, he explained, navigating through traffic. This morning was pretty good. She knew who I was, remembered she was in a hospital. But sometimes she thinks it's 1985 and she needs to get home to make dinner for Dad and me. He glanced at Jasmine. If she seems confused, just go along with it. Correcting her only causes distress. Jasmine nodded, suddenly nervous. Should I remind her how we met? Or would that upset her? Just be yourself, Robert said, turning into the hospital parking lot. That's what she responded to in the first place. Memorial Hospital's geriatric wing was brighter than Jasmine expected. Colorful paintings on the walls, large windows letting in afternoon light. Martha had a semi-private room, but the other bed was empty. She sat propped up against pillows, looking small against the white sheets, a TV playing softly in the background. When Jasmine walked in behind Robert, Martha's face lit up with recognition. There you are, she said, her voice stronger than Jasmine expected. I told Bobby you'd come back. Hi, Martha, Jasmine said, approaching the bed. Up close, Martha looked better than she had on the street. Her cheeks had more color, her hair was neatly combed, and she wore a soft blue hospital gown instead of rain-soaked clothes. Did you bring my flowers? Martha asked, looking confused for a moment. Jasmine hesitated, glancing at Robert, who nodded slightly. Go with it. I'll bring them next time, Jasmine promised, sitting in the chair beside the bed. How are you feeling? Ready to go home, Martha said firmly. These nurses are lovely, but there's no place like your own bed. She leaned forward confidentially. Did Bobby tell you? We're moving me closer to his place. There's a nice facility just 10 minutes from his house. Robert, standing at the foot of the bed, smiled. That's right, Mom. Ridgewood Gardens. We're going to visit it next week. Jasmine realized this was new information. That sounds wonderful. Bobby says there's a garden where residents can plant their own flowers, Martha continued. I told him I want to grow daisies. Harold always liked daisies. The visit continued for nearly an hour. Martha drifted in and out of clarity, sometimes perfectly lucid, discussing current events or asking Jasmine about nursing school, other times slipping into memories, referring to Harold as if he might walk through the door any minute. Through it all, Robert gently guided the conversation back when needed, his patience obviously well practiced. During a moment when Martha dozed off, Robert stepped into the hallway with Jasmine. Thank you for this, he said quietly. It's the calmest I've seen her since they found her. She's amazing, Jasmine said honestly. Even with everything scrambled in her mind, her kindness still shines through. Robert nodded. That's Mom. Always thinking of others first. He hesitated. I've been looking into facilities near here. Ridgewood Gardens is real. It's an excellent place near my home in Clayton. But it's expensive. You're really moving her closer to you? Jasmine asked. This was a wake-up call, Robert said, glancing back at his sleeping mother. I've been telling myself monthly visits were enough, that my job kept me too busy for more. But life's short and family is. He trailed off, then cleared his throat. Anyway, I've put in for a transfer to the Clayton office. My company has been wanting me to take a management position there anyway. Jasmine was touched by his commitment. That's a big change. Necessary one, Robert said simply. Oh, and I wanted to ask, the hospital is releasing her tomorrow. We'll stay at a hotel for a few days while I wrap up arrangements back home. Would you be willing to visit again? Having a friendly face besides mine would mean a lot to her. I'd love to, Jasmine said. I work evenings at Molly's Diner, but my mornings are free. Robert's face brightened. Perfect. And maybe, he seemed uncertain for a moment, maybe you could tell me which community resources you were planning to connect Mom with. Before you knew about her situation, I mean. As a nursing student, you probably know more about local support services than I do. Of course, Jasmine said, surprised by the request. I'm thinking about setting up a foundation, Robert explained. Something to help people who are actually in the situation Mom appeared to be in. Elderly folks who've fallen through the cracks of the system. He shook his head. It's been eye-opening, seeing how easily someone can end up on the streets. If you hadn't helped her. Someone would have, Jasmine said, not entirely believing it herself. Robert gave her a knowing look. We'd both know that's not true. The police told me she'd been wandering for days before you found her. Plenty of people must have walked right past. From inside the room, Martha's voice called out, Bobby? Is my friend still here? Coming, Mom, Robert called back. To Jasmine, he added, she means you. My friend. As they re-entered the room, Martha was sitting up straighter, her eyes clearer. Jasmine, she said, using her name for the first time that afternoon. I remember now. You gave me soup and let me sleep on your couch, in the rain. Jasmine took Martha's hand. That's right. You have your grandmother's heart, Martha said, squeezing Jasmine's fingers. She raised you well. Jasmine blinked back sudden tears. How did you know about my grandmother? Martha looked puzzled. Didn't you tell me? About how she raised you. She frowned, her certainty wavering. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe you just saw it in me, Jasmine said gently, the way some people can. Martha smiled, satisfied with this answer. Yes, that's it. I always could see people's stories in their eyes. She patted the bed beside her. Now sit and tell me about your nursing classes. Will you work with old folks like me when you graduate? As Jasmine began to talk, she caught Robert's eye across the bed. His grateful smile told her this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. Somehow, in the most unexpected way, a simple act of kindness during a rainstorm had created connections that none of them could have foreseen. 6 months passed in a blur of classes, work shifts, and hospital visits. Spring turned to summer, and now the first hints of fall colored the trees outside Jasmine's apartment window. So much had changed since that rainy night when she found Martha huddled in a doorway. Jasmine stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the cap on her head. The blue graduation gown from her nursing program looked crisp and new. She'd ironed it twice, wanting everything to be perfect for today. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. We're outside whenever you're ready. No rush. She smiled, grabbing her small purse. No rush, that was Robert's way. Patient and thoughtful, just like his mother. Outside, Robert's car waited at the curb. But it wasn't just Robert today. In the passenger seat sat Martha, her white hair neatly styled, wearing a flowered dress and a broad smile. There she is, Martha called as Jasmine approached. Our graduate. Jasmine leaned into the car window to hug Martha. You look beautiful, she said, and it was true. Martha looked worlds away from the confused, rain-soaked woman Jasmine had found that night. 6 months at Ridgewood Gardens had worked wonders. The facility's memory care unit provided the structure Martha needed, while the garden therapy program gave her purpose. Her dementia hadn't vanished, it never would, but she had good days now. Today was obviously one of them. We brought you something, Martha said, holding out a small gift bag. Open it now, I can't wait until after the ceremony. Jasmine took the bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a silver pin, a traditional nursing pin, with a tiny lamp design. It was mine, Martha explained, her eyes clear and focused. From when I volunteered as a candy striper at the hospital back in my 20s, I never became a nurse like you, but I always wanted to. Martha, this is... Jasmine felt her throat tighten. I can't take this. You already have, Martha said firmly. No returns. Besides, who else would I give it to? It should belong to someone who cares about people. Robert watched from the driver's seat, his eyes suspiciously bright. Mom's been planning this for weeks, he said. Had me search through 3 storage boxes to find it. Jasmine carefully pinned it to her gown. I'll wear it proudly. The graduation ceremony was held in the community college's auditorium, packed with families and friends of the nursing program graduates. Jasmine had worried that Martha might become confused in the crowd and noise, but she remained engaged throughout, squeezing Robert's hand each time a name was called, waiting for Jasmine's turn. When Jasmine Taylor echoed through the speakers, Martha and Robert stood, clapping loudly. From the stage, Jasmine could see them, her unexpected family, cheering for her. Her mother would have been there too, if her health allowed travel from out of state. But she had called that morning, pride evident in her voice as she made Jasmine promise to send plenty of photos. After the ceremony, they went to dinner at a small Italian restaurant that Martha loved. Over pasta and garlic bread, they talked about the future. I accepted the position, Jasmine announced. At Ridgewood Gardens. I start next month as a staff nurse. Robert raised his water glass in a toast to Nurse Taylor, Ridgewood's newest and finest. It had been Robert's idea initially. When a nursing position opened at the facility where Martha now lived, he'd encouraged Jasmine to apply. The salary was better than the hospital had offered, and the hours would allow Jasmine to continue her education toward a bachelor's degree in nursing. You'll see me every day, Martha said happily. Though you'd better still call me Martha, not Mrs. Winters. None of that formal nonsense. Every day, Jasmine promised. And I expect you to keep me on my toes. Oh, I will, Martha assured her with a mischievous smile. I've been saving up my corrections for when you're official. They laughed, and Jasmine marveled at how natural it felt. This odd little family they'd formed, a young black nursing graduate, an elderly white woman with dementia, and her middle-aged son, bound together by a chance encounter in the rain. The foundation paperwork came through, Robert said, changing the subject. We're officially a non-profit now. The Martha Winters Foundation for Elder Care and Housing Assistance. I still think it should have your name on it too, Jasmine, Martha said, frowning slightly. It's your foundation, Jasmine replied. Besides, I'm on the board of directors. That's enough for me. The foundation had started small, just an idea Robert had after seeing how easily his mother could have been lost forever. With his business connections and Jasmine's knowledge of community resources, they'd created a program to help elderly people at risk of homelessness. It now provided emergency housing, case management, and connection to long-term care options for seniors who had fallen through the cracks of the system. We helped 3 people find housing last month, Robert said proudly, and the volunteer program is taking off. We have 15 nursing students signed up to do weekly check-ins with seniors living alone. All because you stopped that night, Martha said, reaching across the table to take Jasmine's hand. When everyone else walked by, Jasmine shook her head. I just did what anyone would do. But they didn't, Robert said quietly. You did. As the evening ended and they walked back to the car, the sky opened up in a sudden cloudburst, rain pouring down just like it had that night 6 months ago. They ran for the car, laughing as they got soaked despite their best efforts. Just like the night we met, Martha said as they settled into the car, water dripping from their clothes. Full circle, Jasmine agreed, smiling. On the drive back to her apartment, Jasmine gazed out at the rain-slicked streets. She thought about how different her life would be if she had hurried past Martha that night. No foundation, no job at Ridgewood, no Martha and Robert in her life. One small choice, to stop instead of walk by, to see someone instead of looking away, had changed everything, not just for her, but for countless others who would be helped by the foundation in years to come. When they reached her building, Robert got out to walk her to the door with an umbrella. At the steps, he hesitated. We couldn't have done any of this without you, he said seriously. You know that, right? Jasmine looked back at the car, where Martha waved cheerfully from the passenger seat, then up at Robert. We did it together, she said, and we're just getting started. Robert smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. See you Sunday for brunch? Wouldn't miss it, Jasmine promised. As she unlocked her apartment door, she heard their car pull away. Inside, she carefully hung up her wet graduation gown and placed Martha's nursing pen on her dresser where she would see it every morning, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of kindness and that family can be found in the most unexpected places.